He stood in my living room holding paint samples for a nursery I never agreed to, and told me I didn't need my own space anymore. That's when I realized I wasn't just being erased, I was being replaced. In this story, I'll take you through the quiet unraveling of a mother's trust, the silent strength it took to disappear without a word, and how I turned loss into liberation. If you've ever been pushed aside by the very people you once made sacrifices for, this story is for you. My name is Joanna Miller, and I turned 62 on a Thursday. It wasn't a milestone birthday. There was no cake shaped like a number, no candles to blow out, no surprise party waiting behind a darkened door. Just a quiet morning, a strong cup of coffee, and the thought that maybe, just maybe, my son would remember. Not with a gift, not with anything fancy, just a dinner, a visit, his presence. When you get to my age, your definition of celebration changes. You stop craving noise and attention, and you start longing for warmth. The kind that doesn't need to be explained or arranged. For me, that meant Evan and his wife Brielle coming over for a simple meal, a few hours together, a toast to another year. I wasn't asking for the world, just a seat at the table I'd set my whole life. It's strange thinking back on the life I built. My husband Mark and I bought this apartment the year Evan turned 4. It was nothing extravagant. 2 bedrooms, a little balcony, squeaky floors that groaned in the winter. But it was ours. We painted every wall by hand. Mark insisted on putting in the ceiling fans himself, even though he was terrified of ladders. I used to laugh at how uneven they were until I found him in the kitchen one night, with the instruction manual spread open, muttering to himself like it was a sacred text. We lived a quiet life. Books, music weekend, walks by the marina. We didn't have much, but we had enough. Then came the silence. Cancer doesn't knock. It just walks in and makes itself at home. Mark was gone 6 months after his diagnosis. One day he was fixing the leaky faucet. The next I was holding his hand through a morphine fog, whispering goodbye into a room that smelled like antiseptic and resignation. When he died, I didn't cry the way people do in movies. I just folded his robe, slowly, button by button, and I placed it in the drawer he'd used for 23 years. After that, it was just Evan and me. He was in college by then, living in a dorm 2 towns away, but he came home every other weekend, at least at first. He was always smart, always driven, but a little reckless. Lost his scholarship sophomore year because he partied too much. He didn't tell me right away. I found out through a financial aid letter addressed to the house. I remember reading it at the kitchen table, the exact same spot where I used to cut the crusts off his sandwiches. I didn't yell. I just called him and said, "Tell me what you need." And I wired the money the next morning. That became the pattern. Evan would fall and I'd offer my hands before he even asked. When his car broke down during finals, I paid for the repairs. When he moved off campus and couldn't afford rent, I co-signed the lease and sent him grocery money. He never said no, but he never said thank you either. Not really. It wasn't malicious. It was just assumed, like the sun would rise and Mom would fix it. When he met Brielle, I wanted to like her. Truly. She had this delicate way of speaking, like every sentence was rehearsed, but still sweet. She was beautiful. There's no denying that. And I could see why Evan was taken with her. But from the start, there was a tension. She called me Joanna instead of Mom. She corrected Evan in front of me when he told stories about his childhood. Small things, but they built up like dust on a windowsill. Noticeable only when the light hits just right. They got engaged after a year. Evan called to tell me on a Tuesday evening. I remember because I was watching a rerun of Jeopardy, and I muted the TV as soon as I heard his voice. He sounded nervous, like he was asking for permission. I told him I was happy for him. And I was. Then he mentioned the wedding venue. It was gorgeous, historic, and far out of their price range. A week later, I wired over $7,000 from my savings. No one asked me to. I just didn't want Evan to feel ashamed. I told myself it was love, not enabling, that helping him was how I kept Mark's legacy alive. That's what we would have done. Mark and I. We were the type to sacrifice quietly. After the wedding came the conversations about starting a family. It didn't come easy for them. They tried, then tried again. Eventually, Brielle sat across from me one afternoon, eyes glistening, and said the words I was both expecting and dreading. "We're looking into IVF, but it's expensive." I nodded before she even finished the sentence. "Of course," I said. That night, I sold a bond Mark left behind. I told myself it was for a good cause, a child, a continuation, but the child never came. And the gratitude never did either. I didn't keep a tally. I never had a spreadsheet or a list. But sometimes late at night I'd look at the balance in my bank account and wonder how much of it had gone to things I couldn't even name. Rent, repairs, registries. I told myself it didn't matter. That's what mothers do. They give without expecting applause. And now here I was, 62. Alone in the apartment Mark and I had built with calloused hands and soft hearts. I had baked lemon tart from scratch, Brielle's favorite, and bought Evan that Cabernet he liked but could never pronounce. I lit the rosemary candle Mark used to tease me about. I cleaned every surface until my knuckles ached. And I set the table for 4 even though I wasn't sure they'd come. I didn't want gifts. I didn't want speeches. I just wanted my son to remember that this space, this home, was still filled with love, that I was still here, still holding space for him like I always had. I didn't know it yet, but that night wasn't going to be a celebration. It was going to be the beginning of something else, something that would change everything. They arrived late. Evan texted me 10 minutes after 6. Running behind, followed by a thumbs up emoji. That's how he communicates now. Little symbols instead of full thoughts. I told myself not to be disappointed. They probably got caught in traffic. It was fine. The food was still warm, the candles still glowing. When they walked in, Brielle was all smiles, glossy, and curated like she'd stepped out of a magazine shoot. Her hair perfectly blown out makeup, subtle but deliberate. She hugged me gently as if not to wrinkle her blouse, then handed me a small gift bag that smelled faintly of lavender. "Happy birthday, Joanna," she said with that voice she uses when she wants something to go smoothly. Evan gave me a one-armed hug. "Hey, Mom." I didn't mind the casual tone. Not then. I was too focused on being grateful they came at all. A few of my neighbors were already there, sitting politely around my living room with plates balanced on their knees. Mrs. Thompson, who's known me since Mark was alive, leaned in and whispered, "You always put together the coziest gatherings, Joanna." I smiled at her, but my eyes kept flicking back to Brielle and the gift bag she placed in my hands. "Go ahead," she said, eyes bright. "Open it." I peeled back the tissue paper. Inside was a white cotton baby onesie, embroidered in soft gray letters. "Best grandma ever." I froze. I looked at Brielle. Her smile widened. "We thought it was time to share the news," she said, laying a hand gently across her stomach. "Just a few weeks along, but it felt like the right moment. Especially now that we'll have more space." More space. I echoed, my mouth dry. Evan stepped forward, then holding up his wine glass. "Can I get everyone's attention?" The room went quiet. Even the clink of silverware seemed to hush. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight." He began, his voice louder now, polished. "This isn't just about my amazing mom's birthday, though of course we love celebrating her. It's also about a new chapter for our family." My chest tightened. "Brielle and I are moving into Mom's apartment." I blinked. The words didn't make sense. "Move in. What, she's been so generous," Brielle added quickly, already recording the moment on her phone. Not every mom would hand over her home like this. I felt 100 eyes on me, waiting for me to nod, to smile, to bless this thing that was being gifted in my name without my knowledge. But I hadn't agreed to anything. Not a conversation, not a question, nothing. And yet there Evan stood toasting me like I'd handed him the deed and a welcome mat. I opened my mouth to speak, but my tongue felt thick. My voice locked behind confusion and shame. I mean, it just makes sense, Evan continued. Mom doesn't need all that space, and with a baby on the way, it's the perfect time. They clinked glasses. People murmured congratulations. I just sat there, my hand gripping the edge of the table. My lemon tart untouched, my appetite gone. The worst part wasn't the ambush. It was the way everyone around me smiled and nodded like this was a lovely gesture, like I should feel proud to be replaced. No one asked how I felt. No one checked if this was something I'd offered. The room had already made peace with my absence. I was being phased out politely as if it were natural. Expected. Brielle leaned in, her tone sweet but firm. We'll let you keep your plants on the balcony. I know how much you love your little herb garden. Her little herb garden? Of course, she added with a light laugh. You'll always be welcome to visit. It was said like a kindness, a token of inclusion, as if I should be grateful to still be allowed access to the life I had built from the ground up. I looked at Evan. His eyes didn't soften. They just waited, expected, and in that moment I understood something I didn't want to admit they had already decided. The apartment was theirs. My role was to cooperate quietly, smile, say thank you, fade. Mrs. Thompson caught my eye from across the room. Her expression said it all. Sympathy dressed as politeness. I smiled back, the kind of smile that masks humiliation. I felt like I was watching a play I didn't audition for, yet here I was. Center stage, delivering lines I never agreed to. The walls of my home didn't look like mine anymore. The photos, the books, the furniture, all suddenly felt like placeholders for someone else's story. A younger story. A story with baby blankets and neutral paint swatches, and plans that no longer included me. I excused myself before dessert, muttering something about a headache. Evan offered to call a rideshare. You shouldn't walk alone, he said, as if I were suddenly frail. I declined. I needed the air. 3 blocks in heels I hadn't worn in years. Every step blistered. Every breath hurt. But I walked anyway. And the night that had started with a wish for togetherness ended with the cold, hard truth I had been written out of my own home. And I wasn't sure yet if I'd ever get to write myself back in. I didn't go to bed that night. I couldn't. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table in silence, staring at the glass of untouched wine I had poured before the party. The rosemary candle had long since burned down, leaving only a pool of wax and the faint scent of something that used to feel like home. My heels were abandoned by the door, my feet sore and swollen, but I barely noticed. Everything felt wrong, tilted like the ground had shifted without warning. It wasn't just the surprise announcement or the baby onesie or the clinking of glasses in a toast I never agreed to. It was the way the room seemed to bend around their version of the story, how everyone just accepted that I had handed over my home without a single protest, as if it were natural, as if it were time. And I kept thinking about Brielle's voice, soft and sweet, saying, "You can still keep your plants on the balcony." That line played over and over in my mind like a broken record. Not do you want to? Not are you ready? But you can still, as if everything else had already been decided. Eventually, I got up and walked slowly to the bookshelf in the hallway, the one Mark had built the year we moved in. I ran my fingers along the spines of old photo albums, finally pulling down the thick blue one labeled Family, 1989-2004. The cover was dusty. I hadn't opened it in years. I sat back down and flipped through the pages. There we were, Mark in his corduroy jacket, squinting in the sun as he grilled burgers on the balcony. Evan as a toddler gripping his father's hand while dragging a stuffed dinosaur behind him. Me in an apron holding a wooden spoon like a scepter mid-laugh. Each picture was a snapshot of a time when this apartment wasn't just walls and furniture. It was laughter, burnt toast, scraped knees, late-night whispers, and love that filled the corners. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And now, It felt like even the memory of that was being overwritten. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry. Instead, I remembered something odd, something I had buried under years of busy days and unspoken gratitude. It was a moment from 2 years ago, during that rough winter when I'd been admitted to the hospital with pneumonia. Evan had shown up brisk and concerned, carrying soup and a stack of paperwork. "I just want to make sure everything's in place," he had said, eyes darting toward the heart monitor. Just in case. At the time, I was exhausted, my lungs on fire, my head clouded with fever and IV drips. He handed me a pen and pointed to the signature line of a form labeled Power of Attorney. I remember frowning. "It's just a precaution," he said. "Totally standard." I signed it without reading. At the time, I thought he was being responsible. I even felt proud. My son stepping up. But now that memory crawled back like a warning. I stood, my legs shaky, and made my way to the filing cabinet Mark and I used to jokingly call the Fort Knox of paperwork. It was where we kept everything. Wills, deeds, birth certificates, even expired warranties from appliances we no longer owned. I searched through the folders until I found it. The form, Power of Attorney, signed by me, Evan's name written neatly under agent. My stomach dropped. Had I ever revoked this? Had I even thought to? The room felt colder suddenly. The kitchen clock ticked louder than usual. I picked up my phone and texted Claire Jensen, my lawyer and an old friend of Mark's. It was after midnight, but I didn't care. "Claire, I just found a POA form I signed in 2022 when I was sick. Is it still valid?" I stared at the screen until her reply popped up at 6:42 a.m. "If you never revoked it, yes. We need to talk today." I didn't reply. I just sat there frozen. Evan wasn't hopeful I'd say yes. He wasn't planning to convince me. He already believed he had the authority to act. The dinner wasn't a question. It was a performance. A final step in a plan that had likely been in motion for months. I opened Instagram. Brielle had posted a story the night before. My heart thudded as I clicked. A soft acoustic track played under a slow sweeping video of my living room. My couch, my curtains, my bookshelf. Her caption read, "New Beginnings." Saying goodbye to Grandma's space and hello to our first real home. Feeling so blessed. I stared at it in disbelief. She had filmed my private space like it was a walk-through tour. There were dozens of likes already, dozens of comments from people I didn't know. Such a beautiful place. "You're so lucky her mom is generous. That living room has so much charm. Can't wait to see how you decorate." Decorate. She hadn't even waited a full day. My name was still on the deed. My coat was still hanging by the door. And yet, to the world, they had already moved in. I clicked her profile and saw a new post, a Pinterest board titled Neutral Nursery Vision, a caption that said, "It's going to be magical. Fresh start, fresh energy, fresh start." At my expense, I felt something in me harden. Not rage exactly, not grief either, just clarity, cold and steady. Evan wasn't asking for space. He was claiming territory. And now that I had seen it, really seen it, I knew there would be no going back. They thought I'd be too passive to fight. They had mistaken my love for permission. They were about to learn the difference. I woke up with a different kind of clarity. Not anger, not even grief. Just precision, the kind of focus you get when you stop hoping things will go back to how they were and start realizing you've been slowly pushed out of your own life, one smiling suggestion at a time. That morning, I did something I hadn't done since Mark died. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and created a folder. I called it Proof. Inside, I began collecting what I now understood were not just sweet gestures or miscommunications, but pieces of a much larger plan I hadn't been invited to participate in. I saved every screenshot I could find. Brielle's Instagram story, captioned New Beginnings. Saying goodbye to Grandma's space, and hello to our first home, was the first file. It wasn't even subtle. There was my living room, my coffee table, my throw blanket folded the way I always folded it, framed through her lens like it already belonged to her. I paused the video on a shot of my bookshelf. Mark's old spy novels lined up next to the seashell frame Evan made in second grade. The caption read, "Clearing out the old, making space for the new." I saved that one too. Next, I pulled up the Pinterest board Evan had sent me a few weeks earlier. At the time, I thought it was just him sharing ideas. "We thought you'd enjoy this," he'd texted. The board was called Baby Room Inspiration, Soft Neutrals. I hadn't clicked through all the images then. I was too tired. But now with new eyes, I saw what I missed before. The notes written under each image: crib will fit perfectly against bedroom wall. Replace outdated ceiling fan. Open up closet for stroller storage. Natural light best for early bonding. Every comment was marked with either Evan's or Brielle's initials. They weren't imagining the space. They were planning it. And not just planning the nursery, they were redesigning my bedroom, my sanctuary. The room where Mark and I once whispered about the future after turning off the lights. I closed the board and moved to my texts. Evan had written me a message about a week before the dinner. "We'll help you pack up whenever you're ready. Maybe we start with the hallway closet this weekend?" He added a smiley face at the end like it was a casual chore, something we'd both agreed to. Only, I hadn't. I printed the text thread, I highlighted the date, I added it to the binder. There was also an email from Brielle with the subject decluttering plan, for when you're ready. I opened it again. It read like a task list for someone who had already moved out. Donate old coats to the church drive. Offer the teacups to the women's group. Bag up Mark's tools, maybe Evan can sort. Digitize photos if you want. Clean out kitchen drawers. Leave space under the sink for baby bath supplies. It was all so considerate, so coordinated, so presumptive. There was no, "Would you like to?" Just "Here's what we're doing." That email, too, went into the folder. Around 3 p.m. The doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was Brielle. She stood there with a paper gift bag and a bright, unbothered smile. "Just thought I'd bring you a treat," she said. "Hazelnut cold brew. Extra ice, right?" I nodded. I hadn't told her that in over a year. But she remembered. Selective memory, I suppose. She stepped in without waiting for me to invite her like she already had a key. She sat down in my living room and immediately launched into conversation. "I just wanted to check in on the move," she said breezily. "Not rushing you, of course. We know transitions are emotional, but Evan found a handyman who's available next week for small updates. Painting, possibly flooring. I think soft oak laminate would really brighten up the second bedroom. Babies thrive with natural tones." She spoke like a project manager walking through a space she was preparing to gut. She pointed out where the crib would go, how the bookshelf would need to be rehomed, and how she hoped I wouldn't mind if they updated the art. Honestly, she said, "You deserve a fresh start, too. Downsizing can be so freeing." My throat tightened, but I said nothing. I just nodded. While she talked, she dug into her purse looking for a lip balm, then left the bag half open on the armrest. When she excused herself to use the restroom, I looked down. And that's when I saw it. A manila folder. My name and address typed on the cover. I pulled it out gently. Inside were a floor plan of my apartment, measurements of every room, a list of furniture to replace or remove, an estimate from a real estate agency titled Projected Flip Value $712,000. Buyer notes. Great for couples working remotely. Potential for luxury short-term rental. I took out my phone and photographed every page. Then I carefully slipped the folder back exactly where it had been. When she came back, she smiled again like nothing had happened. "I think we'll keep the dining table. At least for now," she said lightly. "But we might repaint it." I offered her some crackers, listened while she planned out her dream version of my home, and all the while, I kept nodding like I wasn't building a case with every word she spoke. After she left, I locked the door. Then I locked it again. And I opened that folder on my computer. Proof. I renamed it Plan, because I finally saw things clearly. This wasn't just about a nursery. This wasn't about sharing space. This was about erasing me, neatly, sweetly, and with a ribbon on top, but they had made one miscalculation. They thought the woman who had quietly built everything would quietly give it away. They were wrong. The morning after Brielle's visit, I stood in the hallway of my own apartment holding a screwdriver and a new deadbolt. I had ordered it late the night before, unable to sleep, and when the package arrived, I opened it with the kind of resolve that comes only after you've stopped trying to explain yourself to people who don't listen. For 30 years, the locks on that door hadn't changed. Mark and I installed the originals together our first spring in the place. I remember how he insisted on doing it himself even though he was terrible with tools. We spent the whole afternoon laughing, trying to figure out which way the screws were supposed to turn. That lock was more than a piece of metal. It was a memory, a symbol of the life we built. But memories don't keep you safe from betrayal. So I changed it. The keypad at the front gate of the building was next. I filed a request with the building manager to update the access code citing personal safety concerns. I didn't elaborate. No one asked. Then I made a list. My own kind of security plan. I titled it simply, Things I Need to Protect. At the top was my sense of reality, followed closely by the deed. My financial records, Mark's will, our marriage certificate, copies of emails, texts, and social media posts. Anything that could prove I was mentally sound and fully aware of what was happening. I bought a fireproof, waterproof lockbox, the kind people use for emergencies or evacuation prep. I slid everything inside, organized by color-coded tabs, legal, financial, medical, personal. The act of doing it, of touching each document and giving it a name and a place, felt like stitching a torn seam inside myself. I wasn't unraveling. I was reinforcing. I also removed a few things from my usual routines. No more evening wine. No more little blue pills to sleep. It was tempting. God, it was tempting. But I couldn't afford even a moment of fog. Not now. Not when I knew they were positioning me to be fragile, forgetful, easily nudged out of place. So I drank tea instead. I stretched every morning. I started writing. Everything. I kept a bound journal on my kitchen counter. In it, I recorded the mundane. What I ate for breakfast, what time I went to bed, what I bought at the store, what the weather was like, any visitors' calls or texts, my mood, my thoughts. Every page dated, every entry signed. If anyone ever tried to say I was confused or incapable, I'd have hundreds of pages saying otherwise. Pages of calm clarity of full presence. I made sure of it. And then, quietly, I turned inward and did something I hadn't done in years. I looked at the numbers. I pulled out every receipt, every transfer, every casual loan or favor that had been asked of me over the years. I created a spreadsheet and named it What I've Given. It was a long list. Evan's college tuition after he lost his scholarship, $14,800. First apartment rental deposit, $2,400. Car repairs, twice, $3,200. Wedding contribution, $12,000. IVF treatment, $9,200. Emergency funds during the early days of the pandemic, $6,000. New laptop for Brielle after hers was stolen, $1,300. Grocery help just for the month, $900. Therapy bills, they couldn't cover, $1,500. The custom crib they picked out and I ordered as a surprise, $200. There were more. I added a line at the bottom that simply said, unreturned favors, undocumented costs. Emotional labor incalculable. I didn't write the list to shame them. I didn't intend to send it or show it to anyone. I wrote it for me. To remember that I had been more than generous, that I had loved, provided, supported, and sacrificed, consistently and without expectation, that the narrative of me as some stubborn old woman hoarding space and clinging to things was a lie. They weren't being pushed out. They were pushing me out, with every assumption, every message, every smile that hid control. So I shifted, quietly. No calls, no warnings, no confrontation. I just changed. I started saying no, even if only in silence. No, I will not move out on your timeline. No, I will not let you treat my history like clutter. No, I will not leave quietly. But I would leave strategically, and I would do it in a way they wouldn't see coming. Because I had learned something through all of this. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do isn't to shout, it's to prepare. It's to put the documents in a box. It's to lock the door. And then when the time is right, it's to walk away from the fire. Before anyone even notices the smoke, I met with Claire the following Monday morning. Her office was tucked inside a quiet building above a florist, the kind of place where the windows let in too much sun, and the chairs had a floral print that hadn't been in style for decades. But it was safe, familiar, and I needed that. I brought every folder, every document, every screenshot. I had 3 manila envelopes in my bag and a USB drive with duplicates. Claire didn't make small talk. She just poured coffee into a chipped mug, pulled her glasses down onto her nose, and said, "Let's begin." She reviewed the power of attorney first. "You never revoked this," she said, flipping the page. "Technically, he could act on your behalf, especially if there's even a shred of doubt about your mental clarity." I stayed quiet, my fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of the chair. Claire continued, "It doesn't matter that you're well now. All it takes is one doctor's note, one report that says you're exhibiting signs of confusion, memory lapses, or instability. It's rare, but it's happened, especially when real estate's involved." I felt cold all over. I thought I had prepared for this conversation, but I hadn't been ready for the sharp edge of it, the legal reality. The fact that my son could, on paper, strip me of my autonomy before I even had a chance to say no. "We'll revoke it immediately," Claire said. "Starting today, you don't sign anything. You don't respond emotionally." Everything, texts, emails, calls, comes through me. I nodded, stunned. She reached across the table and touched my hand. "This isn't your fault, Joanna. But you do need to protect yourself now." That evening, I walked home slowly. The sun was beginning to set, casting that orange glow that made the city look softer than it really was. I reached the gate to my building and punched in the new code we had recently set. It didn't work. I tried again. Still nothing. For a brief, terrifying moment, I wondered if Evan had somehow overridden it. Had he accessed the building records? Had he convinced management I was being erratic? My hands started shaking. I tried one more time. The code worked. Just delayed. The gate buzzed open. I stood there for a moment, holding my breath. My chest felt tight, like something had wrapped around it. Not fear, just a deep, sinking dread. A sense that my home was no longer mine. That at any moment someone else might walk in and call it theirs. When I reached my apartment, I double-locked the door and stood quietly for a while. Everything was still in place. The couch, the framed photographs, the little ceramic bowl I kept my keys in. But the air felt wrong, heavier. I went into the kitchen and put on water for tea, but I didn't drink it. I just sat at the table staring at the cup as the steam faded into nothing. Later that week, Brielle texted me again, just stopping by, bringing that hazelnut latte you love. She didn't ask if I was home. Didn't ask if it was okay. She just came. When I opened the door, she was standing there as always, bright and cheerful, holding a drink tray and a large purse slung over one shoulder. Hi, she said. "Can I come in for a second?" I forced a smile and stepped aside. She moved through the apartment like it already belonged to her, her eyes scanning corners, her shoes clicking across the floor with practiced familiarity. She chatted about Evan's latest work project, the nursery theme she was considering, and how hard it was to choose between sage green and soft peach for the walls. She set her purse down on the armrest and walked into the kitchen to rinse her straw. I glanced at the bag. It was slightly open. I didn't want to look. I truly didn't. But something inside me, something instinctive and quiet, told me I needed to. I leaned forward and peeked inside. There it was again, a manila folder labeled with my address and Brielle's neat handwriting. I eased it open just an inch. Inside were floor plans of the apartment mock-ups of an updated kitchen and what made my pulse stop? An estimate from a local brokerage potential sale value post-renovation, $710,000 plus. Target young professionals, remote workers, short-term investors. This wasn't about the baby. This wasn't even about family. They were flipping my home, maybe even before the baby was real, if there was one. I pulled out my phone and took photos of every page. Quietly, calmly. By the time she returned from the kitchen, I had zipped the folder shut. She sat across from me, legs crossed, still smiling. "I know this transition has been hard," she said, "but I promise we'll make sure it feels like you're still a part of everything." I nodded, eyes dry. I offered her a stale cookie and asked if she needed anything else. She said no. As she walked out, she looked back and added, "Evan wants to stop by this weekend to talk next steps." Next steps? I stood at the window and watched her walk down the street, and for the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel afraid. I felt done. Done waiting to be asked. Done playing along. Done giving pieces of my life to people who didn't think I noticed they were stealing. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a takeover. And I was finally ready to end it. I used to believe that leaving meant failure. That walking away from something, especially from family, meant you had given up too soon. That if you tried just a little harder, stayed just a little longer, loved just a little louder, you could fix it. But I don't believe that anymore. The morning I decided to disappear, the sky was pale and cloudy. The kind of morning that felt undecided, suspended in its own silence. I woke before the sun made a cup of tea instead of coffee, and sat by the window until the first light cracked open over the rooftops. Then I picked up the phone and called Margaret Lacey. She answered on the second ring. Joanna. I hadn't spoken to Margaret in years. Not really. We used to run community book drives together. She was a real estate agent for decades, but these days she mostly grew roses and knitted scarves for cancer patients. Still, Margaret had one of those voices that carried both warmth and steel. I always admired that about her. Margaret, I said I need to disappear. And I need your help. She didn't ask questions, not right away. Instead, she simply said, "Talk to me." So I told her everything. Not just the surface-level facts, not just the dinner or the baby onesie or the keys that no longer turned. I told her about the years that led up to it, the long arc of giving, the constant erosion of boundaries disguised as gratitude, the soft erosion of self that happened when love turned into obligation. Margaret listened without interrupting. And when I was finished, she said, "Okay, we do this clean. No listings, no signs, no digital trail. I know someone who'll appreciate the space without asking questions." Within days, she'd found the perfect couple. An older man and his wife, both recently retired, both looking to move closer to their daughter who was undergoing long-term treatment at the hospital 2 blocks from my apartment. They wanted quiet, safety, a home with history, not glamour. "They're not flashy," Margaret said. "They're grateful, and they're ready to move fast." That was all I needed to hear. While Evan and Brielle continued posting carefully curated updates on their transition into a new chapter, I was quietly transferring ownership of the apartment into a trust under Claire's guidance. The trust would hold every asset I had left. My savings, the apartment sale proceeds, even the small inheritance Mark left me when he passed. We named it after him the Mark Elliott Miller Community Endowment. Its mission would be to help older women like me who found themselves quietly being erased from their own lives. Women who were told to be grateful, who were labeled dramatic when they said no, who were manipulated in the name of love. Everything I owned now had a purpose, larger than me. No one would be able to contest it. No legal loopholes, no family pressure, no guilt. Meanwhile, I began packing. But not everything. Not the couch Evan wanted. Not the table Brielle had already picked a table runner for. I let them keep the things they thought mattered. I packed the pieces of me they never noticed. Mark's favorite sweater still folded in the back of my drawer. My mother's recipe cards yellowed and torn. The quilt I made with my sister the year our dad died. A set of teacups from our wedding registry. Photo albums from when Evan was still a boy who brought me dandelions and hand-drawn cards. The small ceramic cat that sat on the windowsill for 30 years. Each item was wrapped in silence and placed gently into boxes labeled Keep. I hired Frank, a man from church who owned a truck, and asked no questions. We loaded everything I needed in one trip. No movers, no friends, no witnesses, just Frank, the hum of the engine, and a heart that beat a little steadier with every mile between me and the apartment. Before I left, I unplugged the landline. I canceled the utilities. I forwarded my mail to a post office box under a new name I'd registered weeks ago. Joe E. Morgan. Just a variation. Just enough to create distance. I deleted old voicemails. I changed the locks again. I updated my emergency contact to Claire and made sure the trust had no beneficiary Evan could access. I wiped every trace of vulnerability and replaced it with intent. The day the sale closed, I stood in the center of the now empty apartment and took one last look. The walls were still the same pale gray. The floors creaked in the same places. But the space felt free, not just of things, but of expectation. I left the keys on the counter and walked out without looking back. That night, Evan texted, "Hey, Mom, are you free tonight?" We thought we'd swing by to measure the walls and bring the final paint samples. Brielle's thinking a soft sage for the nursery. I didn't reply. An hour later, another message came. "We're outside, but the key's not working." "Did you change it again?" I turned off my phone. Later, Margaret called to say the new owners had moved in. "They're thrilled," she said. She cried when she saw the balcony. I smiled. Not because they were happy, though I was glad, but because for once I had made a move that was entirely my own. No permission, no guilt, just choice. Evan never saw it coming. They had counted on me to stay soft, to stay small, to stay silent. But I didn't. I left them not just out of the apartment, but out of the plan, the papers, the picture. I didn't announce it. I just vanished. And that silence. It said everything. The knock came just after 7 in the morning, not at my door, but at the door of the home I no longer lived in. The door Evan still believed led to his future, the one he had publicly claimed as his own, the one he thought I'd quietly leave behind for him, but I was already gone. I received a message from Claire not long after. She'd been contacted by the new owners. Apparently Evan had shown up with Brielle in tow. Yaba sai sa samam. He tried his old key, and when it didn't work, he banged on the door demanding to be let in. He insisted there had been a misunderstanding, that the apartment was still his mother's and that he had every right to access it. The couple was kind but firm. They told him they had purchased the unit, legally had documentation, and that he needed to leave. He didn't take it well. He left muttering something about lawyer's legacy and betrayal. Claire forwarded the report with a note. "They're escalating." I wasn't surprised. I knew this part would come. I had spent years teaching Evan that I was available, that I was accommodating, that I could be bent without breaking, and now that I had simply stepped out of his frame, he was furious. Later that day, a courier delivered a thick envelope to Claire's office. The return address was a law firm neither of us had dealt with before. Wexler and Nash. The letter inside was a masterpiece of manipulation dressed as professionalism. It expressed concern for the well-being of Joanna Miller, citing her recent uncharacteristic behavior, her abrupt withdrawal from family, and a sudden property transfer that may have occurred under distress or confusion. They were asking for a third-party mental health evaluation. They referenced the old power of attorney. They used words like protective concern and best interests. I read the letter in Claire's office, my hands steady but my throat tight. "This is a power grab," she said. "A last-ditch effort to paint you as unwell. They're hoping to intimidate you into handing over what you refused to give willingly." I nodded. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. Because I had been preparing for this exact moment. "What do we do?" I asked. Claire looked at me gently. "We don't do anything reactive. We don't answer directly. We send the right paperwork. Calm, factual, final." So that's what we did. But Evan wasn't done. 2 days later, Brielle returned to the building. But not to talk, not to apologize. She came to perform. She stood outside the unit she once claimed as her nursery to be, holding her phone up like a stage light. Her voice echoed through the hallway, dramatic and tearful. "She abandoned us," she cried. "After all we planned. After the baby news. She just disappeared. She wasn't talking to the couple inside. She was talking to her followers." She filmed the empty hallway. The locked door. Her tear-streaked face. Her shaking hands. And then she posted it. The video went live within hours. Captioned, "When your own mother chooses money over family." The comments were swift and brutal. This is what happens when people get old and bitter. How can a mother treat her son and pregnant daughter-in-law like this? She doesn't deserve to be called a mom. Sue her. She's clearly not right in the head. I read every comment. I didn't respond. I didn't defend myself. I just documented. I took screenshots, archived the post, made copies of every message sent to my old number. Some came from extended family, most came from strangers. A few were kind, most weren't, but I wasn't looking for support anymore. I was collecting proof. Later that evening, Claire called me. She'd received a forwarded copy of the video from another attorney. The same law firm was now using it as evidence of emotional instability. "They're trying to build a digital paper trail," Claire said. "But you've done everything right." "I know," I said softly. "Do you feel safe?" "Yes." "Do you feel clear?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Joanna, you've won. I just don't think they realize it yet." That night I sat at my new desk in my new home and created one more folder on my laptop, Final Files. Inside it, I uploaded a video of me speaking directly to camera. Calm, composed, explaining every legal and financial decision I'd made with dates and documents to back it up. My most recent medical checkup summary confirming I was in excellent health and of sound mind. Letters from Claire verifying the legitimacy of every action taken, every screenshot of every post, every message, every attempt to discredit me. Scans of Evan's envelope, the power of attorney form, and the letter from Wexler and Nash. Everything, labeled, sorted, dated, and then I sent the entire folder to Claire with full access and backup copies stored in the cloud. I wasn't documenting to fight them. I was documenting to protect the peace I had built, because I no longer needed to explain why I left. I no longer needed to prove I had been generous, or that I had been mistreated, or that I still loved them even now. The story they told about me wasn't mine to correct, but the one I was writing, that one was true. That one was strong. And most importantly, that one was mine. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not because I was afraid they'd follow, but because I needed this place to be mine. Untainted by old expectations, free from anyone's questions. A place where I didn't have to explain why I left, or justify why I finally chose myself. The cabin was tucked deep into the woods, down a road so narrow that the trees brushed both sides of my car as I drove in. It wasn't fancy. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a sagging porch, and a small kitchen with mismatched tiles that probably hadn't been updated since the 1980s. but the moment I stepped out of the car and felt the hush of the pine trees around me, I knew. I had found something I hadn't even realized I was still searching for: peace. Not the kind people post about online with sunsets and wine glasses and spa music playing in the background. Real peace. The kind that doesn't need to be seen. The kind that doesn't ask for anything in return. Margaret met me there that first morning. She brought coffee and a brown paper bag with a warm muffin from a bakery she loved 2 towns over. She didn't hug me. She didn't say I'm sorry. She just stood beside me in the driveway while I looked up at the crooked roof and the overgrown front yard. "You sure?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah, I'm ready." She handed me the keys without another word. Inside, the air smelled like dust and cedar. There were cobwebs in the corners and water stains on the ceiling, but it didn't matter. It felt untouched. Like no one had ever expected anything from this place except to be exactly what it was. That first night, I slept on a twin mattress laid directly on the floor. No bed frame yet, no lamp. Just me and a blanket I had brought from the old apartment. I lay awake for a while, listening to the sound of crickets, the occasional rustle of wind through trees, and the gentle groan of an old house settling into the night. And then, somewhere between thinking and dreaming, I realized my jaw wasn't clenched. My chest wasn't tight. I slept 8 hours straight for the first time in months. In the mornings, I made oatmeal and sat on the back porch with a chipped mug of tea. The lake was visible through a break in the trees. It caught the light like glass. Sometimes I'd see ducks floating lazily or dragonflies hovering over the surface like they were searching for a reflection of themselves. There was no Wi-Fi. I didn't check email. Instead, I read books from the tiny town library, their spines cracked and pages yellowing. I started a notebook. Not a journal, not a list. Just small observations. The rosemary bloomed. Neighbor's dog barks at exactly 3:15. I didn't flinch when the phone rang. Because it didn't. I joined a local volunteer group that ran a community pantry on Saturdays. No one asked where I came from. No one recognized my last name. To them, I was just Joanna, the quiet woman who sliced bread and restocked shelves and always brought extra gloves in case someone forgot theirs. One Tuesday afternoon, I met Claire. She was 73, wore oversized sunglasses even indoors, and introduced herself by saying, "I'm not lonely. I'm just tired of talking to my cat." She taught me how to play chess on a fold-out card table on her front porch. She was patient, ruthless, and funny in a way that felt like medicine. "You're good at defense," she said after our third game. "You just haven't learned how to go for the win." "I've spent most of my life avoiding checkmate," I replied. She laughed so hard her lemonade spilled. I started cooking again. Not because anyone needed me to, but because it brought me comfort. Roasted vegetables, fresh bread, apple crisp with too much cinnamon. I gave extras to the neighbors. They returned the favor with kind smiles and baskets of tomatoes from their gardens. No one knocked on my door with demands. No one told me I was wasting space. I painted the bedroom walls a soft yellow. I planted basil, thyme, and mint in pots outside the kitchen window. I hung a wind chime from the porch and listened to it sway when the breeze passed through. And somewhere along the way, without trying, I began to smile. Not for someone else's approval, not to keep the peace, but simply because I could. Because for the first time in a long time, my joy belonged entirely to me. One crisp October afternoon, I went to the mailbox and found a letter addressed in handwriting I recognized instantly. My niece, Emily. Inside was a photo of her newborn daughter and a short note. "Aunt Joanna, I named her Claire. I hope she grows up as brave and clear-eyed as you." I pressed the photo to my chest, not in grief, but in gratitude. I pinned it to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a sunflower and made a quiet promise to myself I would live in a way that little girl could be proud of. Not loud, not bitter, but true. That night, I sat on my porch under a quilt watching the stars blink to life one by one and wrote a check to a women's shelter. Not out of obligation, but out of purpose. On the envelope, I wrote 3 words for the next, because starting over isn't giving up. It's choosing to no longer be held hostage by history. It's saying I deserve a life that doesn't ask me to shrink. And now, finally, I was living it. Peace, I've come to realize, doesn't arrive like a parade. It slips in quietly. Sometimes in the sound of your own breath in the morning. Sometimes in the way sunlight lands on your floor. Sometimes in the silence that no longer feels like loneliness. It was a Tuesday. The kind that would have gone unnoticed in my old life. But now, even the smallest days felt sacred. When I opened the mailbox, I wasn't expecting anything. Most of the letters I got out here were bills or donation receipts. But that morning, tucked between the weekly paper and a local seed catalog, there it was, a pale yellow envelope with my name written in soft slanted cursive. I didn't need to check the return address. I knew it was from Emily. I carried it inside with trembling hands and sat at the kitchen table, the one I'd bought secondhand from a woman who used to teach music to kids. I opened the envelope like it might break if I rushed. Inside a photo slid into my lap. A baby girl swaddled in a peach blanket, eyes barely open, her little hand reaching upward. The name Claire was printed softly at the bottom. I stared at it for a long time. Then I read the note. Aunt Joanna, I named her Claire. I hope she grows into your strength. Quiet, constant, and unshakable. If she becomes half the woman you are, I'll be proud. I don't know how long I sat there. The morning light spilled across the table. The tea I had poured went cold. And for the first time in a long time I cried. Not from grief, not from exhaustion, but from release. There it was. A name. A tribute. A bridge. I pinned the photo to the refrigerator with my sunflower magnet, next to a calendar I rarely checked, and a recipe for lentil soup I never got around to making. But that photo, that note, I saw it every morning. It reminded me that even in the rubble, something new can bloom. That afternoon, I pulled out a card from a box I kept in the hall drawer, watercolor peonies on the front. I wrote a check to the women's shelter that had first helped me understand I wasn't alone. Not just financially, but emotionally. I sealed the envelope, and on the flap wrote 3 simple words. Use it well, because I knew what it meant to have someone believe in you when you don't have the strength to believe in yourself. I knew what it meant to feel discarded. Not with shouting, but with absence, with assumptions, with the kind of slow, quiet erasure that happens when people stop seeing you as whole. That evening I walked to the lake. The path was soft beneath my feet, pine needles cushioning every step. The sun was dipping behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of coral and dusty violet. I brought the quilt Margaret had given me and spread it out on the grassy slope. I lay down flat, my hands folded on my chest, eyes turned toward the stars that had just started to blink into view. And I let myself remember, not just the sharp moments, the baby onesie, the folder of floor plans, the video of Brielle crying in a hallway, but the quieter ones, the steady unraveling of identity that had happened over years. The way I had shrunk myself, bitten my tongue, made space for others even when they didn't make space for me. I thought of Mark, his steady voice, his warm hands. The way he used to tell me, "You don't owe anyone your quiet." I hadn't understood it then. I do now. I let the wind rustle through my hair and whispered out loud to the trees, I didn't lose a home. I found my own. There's something holy about choosing yourself, not in rebellion, not in anger, but in clarity, in finally recognizing that some people won't come around. Some people won't say sorry. And that's okay. Closure doesn't always come from their words. Sometimes it comes from your own stillness. In the weeks that followed, I began filling the cabin not with things, but with life. I planted lavender outside the bedroom window. I painted the front door robin's egg blue. I hung a basket by the entryway filled with handwritten notes, quotes that reminded me of who I was when no one else was looking. On Tuesdays, I still played chess with Claire. She told me I was getting better. "You're learning to attack," she teased. "Not just protect." I smiled. "It's about time." On Thursdays, I volunteered at the community center. I started a little writing group for women who thought they had nothing left to say, until they picked up a pen and realized they still had fire. And every night before bed, I whispered a quiet thank you. Not to anyone, just to life, to the version of myself that stayed soft even when the world grew hard, to the part of me that knew I was never wasting space. I was holding it, nurturing it, owning it. For too long, I'd lived in rooms that didn't feel like mine, built around people who never saw me as a whole person. But now I lived in a home that echoed only truth. No performance, no permission, just presence. And that was everything. If this story found you at the right moment, if you've ever felt like your presence was overlooked, your worth taken for granted, or your love mistaken for obligation, then I hope Joanna's journey reminded you of something: you are not wasting space. You are worthy of peace. And sometimes the quietest choices speak the loudest truths. Have you ever had to walk away to find yourself again? What part of Joanna's story echoed something in your own? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, please like it, share it with someone who might need it too, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a voice that just might sound a little like yours.